On August 18, 1590, John White stepped onto Roanoke Island expecting to find a struggling English colony and the family he had left behind 3 years earlier. Instead, he found an empty settlement. The houses had not been burned. They had been carefully taken apart. There were no bodies, no graves, and no obvious signs of a battle. Then White saw the message. The letters CRO had been cut into a tree. Farther inside the settlement, the word CROATOAN had been carved into a wooden post of the palisade. It was not meaningless. CROATOAN was the name the English used for an island to the south, now associated with Hatteras Island, and for the indigenous community living there. White had arranged a signal before leaving in 1587. If the colonists moved, they were to carve the name of their destination. If they left under force, they were to add a cross. No cross appeared beside the word. To White, the clue seemed hopeful. It meant the colonists had probably moved and wanted to be found. But the weather worsened, an anchor was lost, and the search party never reached CROATOAN. White sailed away without seeing his daughter, Eleanor Dare, or his granddaughter, Virginia. That unfinished journey transformed a relocation into a disappearance. More than 4 centuries later, the mystery is often framed as a single question: what destroyed the lost colony? The surviving evidence points toward a more complicated question. What if the colonists did not all go to the same place, and what if the famous word on the palisade was not the solution, but only one part of a planned dispersal? That possibility matters because historical mysteries are often distorted by the shape of the surviving archive. We possess White's moment of discovery, but almost nothing written by the people who made the decision to leave. Their absence turns later evidence into fragments: a word, a map symbol, traded objects, memories recorded generations afterward. The task is not to force those fragments into certainty. It is to ask which reconstruction explains the greatest number of them with the fewest unsupported assumptions. A colony planted in the wrong place. The Roanoke story did not begin with a vanished village. It began with a colonial project already shaped by war, privateering, poor logistics, and damaged relationships. Sir Walter Raleigh's earlier expedition had established a military colony on Roanoke Island in 1585. That settlement was made up of men, and its leaders hoped the island could support English power against Spain. The venture collapsed within a year. Food shortages, internal strain, and violent conflict with nearby Algonquian communities made the position increasingly dangerous. Most of the colonists left with Sir Francis Drake in 1586. The 1587 expedition was meant to be different. It included families, women, and children. John White was governor, and the group was supposed to establish the city of Raleigh farther north in the Chesapeake Bay, where the English expected a better harbor and more room for a permanent settlement. Roanoke was supposed to be a stop, not the destination. According to the National Park Service's reconstruction, the expedition's captain, Simon Fernandez, refused to carry the colonists farther north. On July 22, roughly 118 settlers were put ashore at the site of the earlier failed colony. They found a skeleton from the abandoned garrison and began repairing old structures. The strategic problem was immediate. The settlers had arrived late in the season at a place associated with an earlier English campaign that had already produced enemies. Their food supply was limited. Their naval transport was leaving. Their relations with local communities were fragile. 1. Then the English made the situation worse. After colonist George Howe was killed, White's men attacked a village they believed belonged to hostile Secautan people. The village was CROATOAN, associated with people who had previously maintained more cooperative relations with the English. Manteo, a CROATOAN man who had traveled to England and worked closely with the colonists, remained a crucial intermediary, but the mistaken attack could only deepen distrust. On August 18, Virginia Dare was born. Her birth later became a symbol of English beginnings in America. At the time, it also highlighted the colony's vulnerability. This was not a temporary military camp. Infants and families now depended on a settlement with weak supplies, uncertain allies, and no reliable date for relief. Within weeks, the colonists asked White to return to England for help. 3 years of silence. White expected the separation to be brief. He reached England in November 1587 and began trying to organize a return voyage. But England was preparing for war with Spain. Ships, crews, weapons, and money were redirected toward national defense as the Spanish Armada approached. This delay matters because the lost colony is often treated as if it vanished overnight. The settlers were not left alone. For a few weeks, they were isolated through 3 growing seasons, including a severe drought reconstructed centuries later through tree rings. A 1998 study found that the years from 1587 to 1589 formed the driest 3-year period in an 800-year regional record, with 1587 itself standing out as an exceptionally poor growing season. That evidence does not prove that the colonists starved. It does show that their arrival coincided with conditions that would intensify competition for food. The Algonquian communities around them depended on the same rainfall and the same harvests. English expectations of trade would become harder to satisfy precisely when local supplies were under pressure. Before White departed, the colonists had discussed movement. The National Park Service states that they intended to divide into 2 groups, one remaining at Roanoke and another moving inland in search of a more secure settlement and additional resources. They also agreed to carve their destination if they left the island. That plan changes the logic of the case. The colonists did not need to remain together. They did not need to wait at the original houses. They possessed small boats, tools, weapons, and some knowledge of the sounds and rivers. They also had relationships, however unstable, with indigenous communities who understood the region far better than they did. White made one limited attempt to return in 1588, but the ships were diverted and damaged during privateering. He did not reach Roanoke. Only in 1590 did he secure passage with privateers headed toward the Caribbean. Their priority was not a careful rescue mission. Roanoke was an interruption in a commercial and military voyage. By then, the colonists had spent nearly 3 years making decisions without instructions from England. This is the first major correction to the popular mystery. The settlers were not frozen in time after White sailed. They were a community under pressure, forced to adapt, negotiate, divide, move, and possibly abandon English forms of life in order to survive. What John White actually found. White's account of the 1590 return is the closest thing the mystery has to a crime scene report, and it is striking for what it does not describe. He found no battlefield, no burned houses, no scattered bodies, no graves marking a mass death. The buildings had been taken down rather than destroyed, suggesting that useful timber and materials had been removed. The colonists' boats were gone. A defensive palisade had been built around the settlement, but the site itself was empty. 2. The carved word CROATOAN matched the signaling system agreed upon before White left. The absence of the cross meant, at least according to their plan, that the colonists had not been compelled to move by immediate violence. There were signs of later disturbance. Chests White had buried were dug up. His books, pictures, maps, and armor were damaged by weather and looting. But this destruction did not necessarily happen when the colonists departed. An abandoned settlement could be visited and stripped over months or years. White interpreted the message as evidence that his people had gone to CROATOAN. His reaction is important. He did not write as though he had discovered an incomprehensible word or a threatening warning. He recognized a destination connected to allies. But White's search ended almost immediately. Dangerous seas, worsening weather, and the loss of anchors made the captain unwilling to continue. The party never conducted the obvious next step, traveling to CROATOAN and asking the people there what had happened. That failure left the central clue untested. It also created the emotional structure that later storytelling prefers. A father and grandfather arrives too late. A word points south. A storm prevents the reunion. The ships disappear over the horizon, leaving the colonists suspended between survival and death. For more evidence-based investigations of historical mysteries, you can subscribe here. The purpose is not to remove uncertainty, but to keep uncertainty from being replaced by invention. Now the evidence splits in two directions. One trail follows White's carved clue toward CROATOAN. The other follows the colonists' earlier plan to move inland. Neither trail has produced a final identification of the settlers. Together, however, they suggest that the colony may have fragmented rather than vanished as one group. The CROATOAN Trail. CROATOAN is the most direct clue because it was left by the colonists themselves. The community lived on an island south of Roanoke and had interacted with the English since the first voyages. Manteo served as guide, interpreter, diplomat, and ally. If some colonists needed food, protection, and knowledge of the local environment, CROATOAN was an understandable destination. The simplest version of the theory is that the settlers dismantled part of their colony, sailed south, and joined the CROATOAN community. Over time, English survivors may have intermarried, adopted local practices, or died, leaving few objects that could be recognized as evidence of a separate colony. A later written account appears to support that possibility, but it must be treated carefully. In 1709, John Lawson reported that Hatteras people told him some of their ancestors had been white and could talk in a book, meaning they could read. Lawson also commented on physical traits he interpreted as European. This report was written more than a century after White found the settlement empty. It preserves a tradition, not an eyewitness account. Lawson was also a colonial observer using the assumptions and language of his time. His statement cannot prove direct descent from the 1587 colonists. Archaeology on Hatteras Island has uncovered European objects in native contexts, including fragments of weapons, metal, ceramics, and glass. Some researchers argue that the combination is consistent with English people living among the CROATOAN. More recent reports have highlighted hammer scale, tiny flakes produced during iron forging, as evidence of English technical activity. But the interpretation remains disputed. European objects could reach an indigenous village through trade, salvage, diplomatic exchange, or earlier English visits. The English had been active in the region before the Lost Colony. A sword fragment or gun part does not identify its owner, and hammer scale is useful only if its archaeological context, date, and relationship to other finds are securely established and published. 3. There is also a practical problem. Could CROATOAN support more than 100 additional people during a drought? The National Park Service notes that the island's resources may have been insufficient for the entire colony. That objection becomes less serious if only part of the group went south. This is where the split colony theory gains strength. The word CROATOAN could mark the destination of the people. who remained at Roanoke, or identify where a smaller group expected White to begin searching. It does not require every man, woman, and child to have lived permanently in one CROATOAN village. The strongest conclusion is limited but meaningful. Some colonists probably reached CROATOAN because they deliberately named it and had human connections there. The archaeology is compatible with that movement. It has not yet produced an artifact, burial, or structure that can be tied beyond reasonable doubt to a named member of White's colony. The 50-mile clue. The second trail leads west into the Albemarle Sound. Before White left, the settlers discussed moving roughly 50 miles inland. Centuries later, researchers examining White's map of the region noticed paper patches placed over parts of the drawing. When the British Museum studied the map with transmitted light and imaging, one patch appeared to cover a fort-like symbol near the western end of Albemarle Sound, close to the Roanoke and Chowan River system. The discovery created a new archaeological target known as Site X in present-day Bertie County. Excavations there uncovered a small collection of English material, including fragments of pottery associated with the period of the Raleigh Ventures. The location was near a large indigenous settlement and offered access to inland waterways, farmland, and distance from the exposed Outer Banks. Why does this matter? The site broadly fits the colonists' stated intention to move inland. It also fits a survival strategy. A small English group living beside or within an indigenous community might leave only a thin archaeological signature, especially if it reused native structures and possessed few imported goods. Yet Site X has the same evidentiary problem as Hatteras. The artifacts are suggestive, not identifying. No English building from the 1587 colony has been confirmed. No grave has produced a colonist's remains. No object bears the name of a settler. The pottery could have arrived through trade or through members of the earlier 1585 expedition. The map symbol is also not a perfect locator. 16th-century maps were not modern survey plans, and the patch covers an area representing a large landscape. The fort-like mark may indicate an intended position rather than a settlement that was actually built. It may relate to reconnaissance, defense planning, or information White wanted hidden from Spanish eyes. Even so, Site X changes the question. It demonstrates that an inland destination was not invented by modern theorists. It appears in the colonists' discussions and may also appear, indirectly, on White's own map. A divided movement now becomes plausible in concrete terms. One group could travel south toward CROATOAN, where personal alliances existed. Another could move west along sheltered waters toward an inland site, where better land and larger native settlements offered resources. This does not prove a coordinated two-part relocation. It shows that the two strongest archaeological searches correspond to two routes already present in the documentary record: the massacre story and the weaker theories. A third major theory sends the colonists north toward the Chesapeake Bay, their original destination. 4 years after Roanoke, English settlers at Jamestown collected reports that earlier English people had lived among indigenous communities and that some had been killed before Jamestown's founding. Writers including William Strachey recorded a story that Powhatan's forces had destroyed colonists living near the Chesapeake. The account cannot be dismissed, but it is not a clean confession. It was written years after the supposed event, based on information filtered through interpreters, political enemies, and English efforts to understand a dangerous new environment. Powhatan had reasons to control what the Jamestown settlers believed. English writers had reasons to portray him as a threat. The reported victims were not identified through remains or contemporary documents. The Chesapeake theory also faces a logistical barrier. Reaching the bay from Roanoke required difficult coastal travel. The colonists had boats, but they were not a self-contained naval expedition. Moving families and supplies through open and hazardous waters would carry serious risk. Other dramatic theories perform even worse against the physical evidence. A hurricane could have devastated the island, but White described dismantled buildings rather than wreckage. A storm powerful enough to erase the population would not easily explain the carved destination and the removal of useful materials. Famine and disease were real threats. The drought evidence makes hunger especially credible. Some colonists almost certainly could have died. But mass death at the settlement would normally leave graves, bodies, abandoned property, or a site that had not been methodically stripped. A Spanish attack was strategically possible because Spain was searching for English bases. Yet a Spanish reconnaissance in 1588 found evidence of activity around Roanoke but no English colony to destroy. White later found no clear marks of an assault. The Dare stones, supposedly written messages from Eleanor Dare describing the colonists' fate, created enormous excitement in the 20th century. Most were exposed as frauds or are regarded as unreliable. They show how easily the desire for a solution can produce evidence tailored to the mystery. The weaker theories share one mistake. They assume a single catastrophic event must explain every missing person. The documentary evidence points instead toward movement. The settlement was dismantled. The boats were removed. A destination was carved. Plans to divide had already been made. Catastrophe may have occurred later. People could have died from hunger, conflict, disease, or accident after leaving Roanoke. But the departure itself looks more organized than sudden. Why archaeology cannot close the case? If the colonists moved, why has archaeology not found them? The first answer is scale. The coastal plain contains enormous areas of wetlands, forests, riverbanks, islands, and former village sites. A small group using wooden buildings and carrying a limited number of European objects can disappear archaeologically within a landscape occupied for generations. The second answer is mixing. English goods were already moving through indigenous exchange networks. The 1585 military colony, later voyages, shipwrecks, trade, and salvage could place European material far from its original owner. Archaeologists must distinguish objects carried by the lost colonists from objects that arrived through entirely different routes. The third answer is erosion. Shorelines around Roanoke Island have changed significantly. Parts of the original settlement area may have been lost to water, removing structures and refuse that could distinguish the family colony of 1587 from the male military colony of 1585. 5. The fourth answer is assimilation itself. Survival may have required the colonists to stop behaving like an isolated English town. They could adopt indigenous foods, houses, routes, clothing, and family networks. Within a generation, their descendants might leave fewer recognizably English objects than historians expect. A conclusive discovery would need a rare combination: a securely dated late 16th century context, evidence involving women or children from the 1587 group, a Christian burial pattern or identifiable European remains, and ideally an object or genetic link tied to a documented family. No such combination has been found. DNA has not solved the problem because there are no confirmed lost colonist remains for comparison. Genealogical claims made centuries later are difficult to test, especially after extensive population movement and intermarriage. This does not mean every theory has equal value. Archaeology can rank explanations even when it cannot produce a name. The Hatteras finds make some English presence among the CROATOAN plausible. Site X makes a small inland English presence plausible. The abandoned Roanoke site makes an organized departure more plausible than total destruction there. What archaeology cannot currently determine is whether the material came from white settlers, how many people moved to each location, how long they survived, and whether later violence destroyed one of the groups. The mystery survives not because there are no clues. It survives because each clue identifies a process without identifying every person. The most likely reconstruction. The most responsible reconstruction begins with what was planned before White left. The colony divides. A group remains on Roanoke long enough to maintain the settlement, build or strengthen a palisade, and wait for relief. Another group moves inland, perhaps toward the Albemarle and Chowan River system, where the colonists expect better land, food, and protection from Spanish discovery. As months pass, drought and political isolation make Roanoke less sustainable. The remaining settlers dismantle the houses and load reusable material into boats. Before leaving, they carve CROATOAN, following the agreement with White. They travel south to a community linked to Manteo, or at least send some members there. This sequence is an inference, not a documented diary. But it explains more evidence with fewer assumptions than a single massacre or storm. It explains why White found no bodies. It explains why the houses were taken apart. It explains why the boats were missing. It explains why a destination was carved without a distress symbol. It also explains why later archaeology may produce small clusters of English material in more than one indigenous location. From that point, the histories could diverge. People on CROATOAN may have lived within the local community, exchanged skills, formed families, and gradually lost a distinct English identity. The drought and limited resources could also have caused deaths or pushed survivors elsewhere. The inland group may have remained near an Algonquian settlement, moved again, or become involved in regional conflicts. If some eventually traveled toward the Chesapeake, the later Jamestown massacre reports could preserve a distorted memory of their fate. Not every colonist needed the same ending. Some could die quickly. Some could survive for decades. Some children could grow up speaking an Algonquian language more fluently than English. Some adults could retain Christian practices or literacy while living in native households. Others could be killed during later warfare. 6. This reconstruction also corrects the phrase, "lost colony." The settlers were lost to English records, not necessarily lost in the landscape. From the perspective of the communities that received them, they may have been refugees, relatives, dependents, trading partners, or political risks. That possibility does not turn colonization into a peaceful story. The English had brought violence, territorial ambition, and disease into an inhabited region. Their survival may have depended on the same indigenous societies. Their project sought to displace. Assistance could coexist with resentment. Adoption could coexist with coercion. Alliance could break into conflict. The colony's disappearance may therefore be less like a locked-room mystery and more like the collapse of an institution. The English settlement ceased to exist, while its individual members entered several different histories that the surviving English archive was unable to follow. What Roanoke really means. What is confirmed? In 1587, an English family colony was placed on Roanoke Island instead of its intended Chesapeake destination. Its supplies were weak, its relationships were unstable, and its governor left for help. Before he departed, the settlers discussed splitting and agreed to leave carved directions if they moved. When White returned in 1590, the settlement had been dismantled. He found CRO and CROATOAN, no cross, indicating force, and no clear evidence of a battle or mass death. He believed the colonists had gone south, but weather prevented him from testing the clue. What is probable? The colonists left Roanoke deliberately. At least some likely moved toward CROATOAN. Others may have gone inland. Food stress, indigenous alliances, conflict, disease, and later migration probably produced more than one outcome. What remains unproven? No excavated site, burial, artifact, written record, or DNA result has identified the final location of the full colony. Hatteras and Site X contain important evidence, but neither has produced a discovery that closes the case. The lasting lesson is not that 118 people vanished without leaving a trace. They left a plan, a carved place name, a dismantled settlement, and two plausible directions of travel. What disappeared was the English ability to record what happened next. Viewers should compare White's account with the archaeology, inspect where later reports entered the record, and challenge the assumptions behind every clean solution, including this one. If the colonists survived by joining indigenous communities, should the final chapter of Roanoke be described as the failure of an English colony, or as the beginning of histories that England no longer had the power to name?